is this strange relic of paganism, which is not a quote about, it's not a quote from St Patrick, and it's not a quote about the Gortnacrannagh Idol. It's a quote about another figurine I'm going to show you in a minute. So this paper, it's a bit of a smorgasbord. There's a few things kind of thrown together. It has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that I wrote this talk last night, by the way. And I'm speaking, but there's some other bits of information and work from other people in here, not least Steve Davis, who's been mentioned already, ECD, and Aidan O'Sullivan. Again, Mary just mentioned some of the experimental work. I'm going to touch very briefly on some of that at the end. So I'm going to kind of open things up. Oh, sorry. Yes, beg your pardon. So I'm going to open up the discussion a little bit. And when I say context, I mean context in a kind of very, very broad sense, as we'll see. So to begin with a quote. It lay under 4 feet of firm wet peat, and within Mr. Stewart's 30 years knowledge of the district, there had been 6 feet more of peat above the present surface. The peat over it is of the finest mossy structure, without trunks, branches or woody twigs, and dries into a dense, hard, heavy peat fuel of good quality. That's Scottish doctor antiquarian Robert Christison, writing in 1881 about the discovery of this figurine, which again may be certainly familiar to some of the archaeologists and some of the rest of you as well, maybe. This is the so-called Ballachulish goddess. So on the left-hand side there, you have a photograph of the goddess shortly after her discovery. It's clearly a young woman, the figurine. On the right-hand side there, you have the figurine as she survives in the present day in the National Museum in Scotland, in Edinburgh, where you can go and see her on display. So you can see kind of the change that's happened. That's largely because when the figurine was excavated, it wasn't conserved. It was kind of just taken in a railway carriage down to Edinburgh, and it dried out and desiccated. It's got this very distinctive impression. It phased out. Some people think it looks a bit like Edvard Munch's The Scream phase. Yeah, someone the other day said, or I read somewhere the other day more accurately, other people think it looks a bit like Morrissey. Which, yeah. What's the goddess? Or yeah, I think to the goddess, actually, correct. So yeah, Christison, who's writing about the discovery, and he produced this very lovely kind of sketch map of where the idol was found at North Ballachulish. Again, the detail is unimportant, but it's a very nice kind of record of the find. And just move this on a bit. Other kind of comments on the find at the time come from the Inverness Courier, the newspaper, who picked up and wrote this very, it's actually, the whole account's worth reading. It's remarkably kind of florid and full of literary allusions and so forth. It's very typical of the 19th century. And this is actually looking west. So this is North Ballachulish here, South Ballachulish here. So we're on the west coast of Ireland. So this is looking into Loch Leven. And I think the point here, it's important, is when everything in archaeology is about context. And again, it's a bit of a funny word in archaeological parlance, context. It means kind of lots of things. But I mean, really what we're talking about is that idea of the position and placing of things. I mean, Eve's talked about this already, of things, objects, artifacts within the landscape. And we can think about that in different scales, as in the local context and the broader kind of context as well. So this is kind of what the Courier is talking about here. They say, let it be remembered that from its position, North Ballachulish is the Byzantium of the district. Yeah, as the ancient Byzantium, i.e. Istanbul, to the Thracian Bosphorus, so North Ballachulish to Loch Leven and its Bosporus of Kailash. Ich Padrish, I'm sure someone in the audience can pronounce this better than me, and North Ballachulish should traditionally be one of the chief halting stations on the highway of every movement along the seaboard of the rude inhabitants, northwards or southwards. So again, I think the reason I showed this is whenever we talk about any find, and particularly these artifacts, you know, we have to think about not just the cultural context, but if you like, the environmental and the landscape context as well. And I've started with the Ballachulish goddess because it's just such a wonderful find. Again, this is Iron Age, it dates the Iron Age, the Ballachulish goddess. And subsequent work that's been done on the find spot. So this is a recarving, a remaking of the Ballachulish goddess by Mark Griffiths. And this is the Ballachulish goddess in close to the position she was found on the Ballachulish moss, or at least what survives of the moss. It's much reduced now. And there was some work done back in the late 90s, early 2000s, some GPR survey of the peat basin around there and some environmental work. And what that established is at the time the goddess is being placed in the peat, she's found at the bottom of the peat, as we've heard already. This raised bog environment had been in existence for perhaps 1500 years. So again, the idol in this case seems to be erected right on the edge of this kind of growing moss. And again, that feeds into interpretation in terms of what this figurine might mean. And that's something we can return to later on. So we've got these different contexts, the kind of local context, the bog, the wetland, and the landscape context that the newspaper refers to as well. So again, obviously, this is, again, Mel, I'm sure we'll speak to this later on when we're talking about these figurines. The temptation is to kind of lump them all in together. There obviously is variation, not just in terms of age, but in terms of morphology. So particularly the Gortnacrannagh Idol falls into tradition. Again, Kathy will talk about this, of these carved, kind of peculiar, this one's very sinuous. This is another one from, this is sometimes called the Red Man of Kilbeg. This is Bronze Age, this was excavated by the Irish Archaeological Wetland Unit. But again, you can see the similarity in terms of the notch and the head that we've just seen, and that's something we come back to later on. And the reason I mention this as well is the fact that these figurines, largely the Irish ones, tend to be found in raised bog environments, very similar to the Ballachulish goddess that we mentioned just previously. So again, when we think about these kind of finds, we have to think about what they're made out of, obviously, their form and their context. And again, this is something we've heard about already. And again, I'm not going to say much about these figurines because I'm sure Mel will later. But again, there's a long tradition, you know, of carving figurines, and some are very obviously human, some are very obviously female, some are very obviously male. Yes, that's right. I'm looking at the Brodenberg man, you down there. And some are a bit more debated. So, for example, we've got the Somerset Levels so-called god dolly from southwest England, Neolithic. There's a lot of debate about this. I don't know how well you can see that, whether it is ritual, whether it's a child's toy. Again, it's kind of roughly anthropomorphic. We have the very early Willemstad mannequin, as it's so called, and the Ruiz car images. Now, I know Mel is going to talk about those later on, the remarkable kind of group of figurines. The thing with all these finds is some of them we have better contextual information than others. Some are discovered as the Ballachulish goddess was kind of late 19th century, kind of the understanding of context as we just heard earlier, things got thrown away, associated finds. So these things are often kind of shorn of context, but they're obviously often, when they're all, from wetlands, often from raised bogs, but not always. So again, this brings us round, I think, back to the importance of understanding context and understanding different forms of wetland environment. Again, at Gortnacrannagh, as we've heard, arguably the wetland context of Gortnacrannagh is very different to some of the other raised bog environments we get these figurines from. Is that significant? I think it probably is. How is it significant? I don't really know, but that's something we can maybe talk about today. Related to all this is, again, coming back round to wetlands, is how we perceive and think about wetlands. And again, Mel gave a great talk about this the other night in Dublin. I'm sure it's something she'll talk about later on. And it's culturally specific how we view bogs to a large extent, not completely. Some bogs are dangerous if you wander into them in the dark. If you don't know the way across them, you can fall in a pool. It's difficult to get out again. I'm sure quite a few of you who've worked in wetland archaeology, or anyone who's ever worked on a peat bog knows this already. And even if you know the landscape, it can be very difficult to, you can easily get stuck. It's been the fate of many a wetland archaeologist. And again, the point here is that the raised bog environments, the kind of dominant ones and aren't the typical ones, the Midlands in particular, are these environments that have grown through time. And they often start off as fen environments, which is the kind of environment we see at Gortnacrannagh, that's groundwater fed. Sometimes raised bogs grow from lakes, as you can see in this example here. And then we get the raised bog growing over the top. So to return to that, a lot of the anthropomorphic figurines that we have in Ireland and in that kind of Gortnacrannagh tradition, if I can use that word, found in these raised bog environments, and not so much in the fens, unlike Gortnacrannagh. So different kinds of wetlands, we do get variation. We tend to, in archaeology particularly, I think sometimes in the past, we've kind of lumped wetland environments all together and go, oh, they're just wet, aren't they? They're kind of wet and gloomy and a bit boring and so forth. But, they're not. Wetland environments vary almost as much as any other environment. This is a regenerating raised bog at Abbey Leaks, community wetland restoration project going on there. Pools developing on the bog surface. And still other peatland environments you might see as more benign. This is the North York Moors, blanket bogs, a different kind of environment. The photo maybe makes it look nicer than it is, but the point I'm trying to make here in terms of things like access, movement, kind of resources, perception, these environments can be very different, and that's why it's important we understand exactly what kind of peat we're dealing with. Again, it tends to often get bundled together. And still other fen environments are like this. We can contrast that with raised bogs, which are treeless, and blanket bogs, which are generally treeless, with fen environments, which can have trees on them. So alder, hazel, sometimes oak. And these are very different kinds of environments, as you can see here. So again, to come back to Gortnacrannagh, this is something we're working on at the moment, is what kind of fen are we dealing with? How does that relate in particular to the river that we know is key to obviously the formation of the wetlands, and also site and all the crazy things that are going on there. And another problem we have is the fact that, as we've heard already, most wetlands in Ireland and elsewhere in Europe have been impacted very heavily, whether that's directly by people, by us, drainage, peat cutting, as is the case with most of the Midland raised bogs, an image of one of those here. And of course that drainage and that cutting removes peat, it removes any archaeological material within there, and the drained environments that are left are obviously not great environments for the preservation of archaeology. Okay, so I'm going to speed up a bit. As usual, I'm rambling. So the point I'm making here, it's important we understand context, and the way we do that, we have some models for doing that in terms of particular finds, such as here we have the Tumbay bog body excavations, a kind of model of how to dig a very discrete find, in this case medieval bog body, in its landscape context. What that allows us to do when we can do it is to place sites and finds within the landscape, such as in this case the Tumbay bog body, or the bog legs. The find spot is a very, very wet channel within a wet bog with dry parts within it. So what I'm talking about here is that allows us to kind of have a slightly more nuanced interpretation in terms of the location of these finds. Other such work we might look at, for example, is the work of Roy van Beek, who reinvestigated the find spot of another bog body, the Ede Girl in the Netherlands. They carried out GPR survey of the find spot, and they established the wetland that she was found in was actually quite a small one, kind of small, and they did some really other interesting work looking at the broader landscape context of the find within the landscape during the Iron Age period when the Ede Girl goes into the ground. Anyway, you have to hurry up a bit. So what I'm talking about is different scales within not just archaeological work more generally, but within wetland environmental archaeology, where we have sometimes the ability to move between scales, so a very local scale of discovery through to kind of the wider scale, through to the kind of dryland environment around wetlands. And all these scales are critical in terms of how we interpret and understand these finds. So to finish off quickly, Gortnacrannagh, as we've heard already, it's a fen, the peat is fen peat. We're still working exactly to understand in post excavation the chronology of that accumulation and exactly what kind of fen peat we're dealing with. Things we do know, for example, is the importance of the river. Steve Davis has identified this beetle. This is the riffle beetle within some of the deposits in fen peat. It's a very important beetle because it only lives in oxygenated water, often in gravel bed rivers. So we know the importance of the river and the influence of the river on the formation of the deposits at the site. What kind of fens are we dealing with? It could be wooded, it could be a reed fen like that. Again, this is kind of what we're working on. And just to finish off, we talk about preservation and condition. Something we, as we've heard already from Eve, is the fact that the idol is not in great condition. We think that's probably because the peat itself has dried out. What we know from other experimental work just showed there's a figurine carving workshop where a few years ago, we recreated some of these idols. There's Michael Stanley, in fact, making a replica of the Red Man of Kilbeg. They got put up at the Experimental Centre at UCD, it's in 2016, and they were exhumed, I think it was last year, and they significantly deteriorated through time. And we can contrast that very heavily with the original Red Man of Kilbeg, which, other than a little bit of damage, is in very good condition. So, the point here is, this went into the bog very quickly. It was not stood around in it for very long. We know that from condition and the comparison. So again, in terms of Gortnacrannagh, that's something we need to look at. And just to finish off very quickly, I know I've run over, sorry. The other problem with understanding idols like this is obviously we only get them in wetlands. So in wetlands, obviously we get the posts, sometimes the bottom of the post, as you can see there. That's not the case for dryland, so we just don't know, and this is thanks to Malcolm, we were talking about this the other night, we just don't know whether post holes we get on dryland, what was in some of those posts, were there idols in those as well? We just don't know. So this is a problem in terms of context. Right, I'm going to stop there. Sorry for going on a bit. Thank you.